At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Aurum. Let's begin.
It's very simple, actually.
Princess Lixie reclined on her couch, one polished leather boot draped casually over the other. Around her, the enforcers of the Galactic Federation tore through her chambers, dragging furniture aside, rifling through drawers, and scattering her personal belongings in their search. Her species had become the prime suspects in a scandal of unprecedented scale, accused of hiring humanity to win their war. The results had been catastrophic for her enemies. 1/3 of their forces eradicated in less than a day. Lixie only smiled faintly.
We were losing, so we called humanity to help us.
Detective Fozip's antennae went rigid with her straightforward admission, shooting upward like twin exclamation marks above his bulbous head. The appendages, usually in constant, gentle motion as they sampled the air for chemical signals, had frozen completely still. His big, black eyes widened until they seemed to take up half his face, the compound surface of each eye reflecting dozens of tiny images of the princess sitting calmly on her couch. The green skin on his forehead creased into deep furrows. The detective's four-fingered hand fumbled at the badge clipped to his chest, his usually steady digits trembling as they searched for the tiny activation button. Princess Lixie observed in silence, noting how his other hand clutched the datapad so tightly that his knuckles had paled to a lighter shade of green. At last, his fingers found the switch that began recording, and only then did he speak again. "Princess Lixie of House Turanian," Detective Fozip said, his voice formal. "Are you admitting that your species hired humanity to fight your war for them?" He paused, his thin lips pulling back to reveal rows of pointed teeth. "That you are directly responsible for the deaths of 1/3 of the Crotal species, who are now considered a species in need of help from the Federation and at risk of suffering from technological regression?" Lixie let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of someone who had endured more bureaucratic nonsense than any one afternoon should hold. Her violet eyes, marked by the spiral irises that proclaimed her pure Liarian royalty, drifted over the chaos they had left behind in what, only an hour earlier, had been her perfectly ordered sitting room. She caught sight of herself in the mirror, now shoved to the far side of the room by the enforcer's intrusive search. Her reflection pouted back at her, the telltale look of a Liarian on the verge of losing composure and cursing a certain green detective's lineage all the way back to whatever swamp planet had spawned him. Her pointed ears, once upright and regal, had begun to flatten in anger, and the red streaks threading her pale skin flushed even darker with irritation. Forcing herself to breathe, Lixie summoned every ounce of her diplomatic mind, straightening her spine, lifting her chin, tucking stray strands of silver hair behind her ears. By the time she turned back to face the chaos, her posture radiated calm dignity, even if her eyes betrayed a hint of contempt for those who trampled her personal space.
My species had nothing to do with the Crotil's plight,
she said.
They brought humanity's wrath upon themselves. We were barely involved in this matter.
Detective Fozip's antennae moved skeptically, and he stepped closer, staring down at her. "Your Highness, surely you must see how this appears to us," the detective said, checking something on his datapad. "Your species was losing a war against the Crotil, a war that had been going on for 20 standard years with mounting casualties on your side." He interacted with the datapad and turned the screen toward her. Lines of statistics scrolled past. Casualty counts, resource depletion rates, territories lost and gained. One chart in particular stood out, a damning display of the steady collapse of Liarian military strength over the course of the war. Then, suddenly, humanity intervened on your behalf, Fozip continued, manipulating the display to show a timeline. The point of human intervention was marked with a red line that bisected the data like a wound. You should have known better, Princess. The negotiation of firepower and military interventions across species has been a crime since standard year 40,099. Your species will be formally accused of that crime if you don't collaborate with this investigation.
There was no trade involved,
Lixie insisted, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. She could feel her control slipping, the careful mask of royal composure cracking at the edges.
My older sister simply called humanity for help when we were losing, and humanity came to our aid.
She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her eyes boring into the detective's compound ones.
We haven't paid anything to humanity in exchange for their help, nor are we planning to.
The detective's skepticism was clear. He gestured to one of his subordinates, a younger officer of the same species. The officer handed Fozip another datapad with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Fozip studied the new datapad and laughed. Whatever he was reading clearly wasn't supporting the princess's claims. His antennae drooped slightly, then perked up again as he found something of interest. Princess, you're asking me to believe that humanity saved your planet out of the goodness of their hearts. His tone dripped with disbelief, each word weighted with the kind of sarcasm that transcended species barriers. That this was pure, friendship-based cross-species assistance, where humanity simply preferred the continued existence of the Liarians rather than that of the Crotil, and was willing to act so that nature wouldn't follow its natural course. That they deployed weapons capable of cracking continental plates and eliminating entire fleets in minutes, all from simple altruism. Lixie couldn't help herself. She also laughed. She uncrossed her legs deliberately slowly, the leather of her boots creaking slightly with the movement.
It's not strange at all that humanity preferred the continued existence of my species rather than the Crotil,
she said, her tone conversational now, as if discussing the weather or the latest fashion from the Centauri systems.
My sister has even married a human, but I could never envision that same kind of relationship happening between a human and a Crotil.
She paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth.
Have you ever seen a Crotil, Detective?
She didn't wait for an answer.
Their abrasive fur sheds everywhere, leaving those dreadful orange tufts clinging to anything they touch. I once made the mistake of allowing a Crotil diplomat to sit on this very couch. It took 3 full cleaning cycles to purge the mess, and even now we still find the occasional strand when the light catches just right.
She rose and drifted toward the window as she spoke.
And the smell. Oh, the smell. Like rotting eggs mixed with sulfur.
Turning back to face him, she wore a look of polite revulsion.
And those claws. They never bother trimming them. I can't fathom how they manage to find mates among their own kind, let alone with anyone else.
Detective Fozip cleared his throat loudly. His large eyes darted around the room, taking in the expressions of the other officers. Several had stopped their search entirely, mouths agape at the princess's brazen insults. She had just insulted the Crotil while being recorded, just a day after their species had suffered such a catastrophic defeat. Princess, the detective said carefully, wouldn't you say that the fact that your sister married a human qualifies as a transaction of sorts? He paused, seeming to choose his next words with extreme care, his antennae curling and uncurling in a nervous pattern. Some understandings within the Galactic Federation might interpret your sister using her person to entertain a human as a kind of transaction. Lixie exploded in anger. Her violet eyes blazed with fury, and the red streaks in her skin seemed to glow brighter.
How dare you make such implications about my sister?
Her voice was sharp enough to cut steel.
There was nothing transactional about my sister's relationship with her human.
She began pacing, her boots clicking sharply against the floor.
They met a decade ago when they were both staying at a resort station near the galactic core. She was there for a diplomatic conference on trade route regulations, the most boring assignment imaginable, but she took it seriously because that's who she is.
She whirled to face the detective, her silver hair flying out behind her like a banner of war. The motion was so sudden that Fozip actually stumbled backward, his boots squeaking on the floor.
They bonded over ancient literature and philosophy. It took them years to admit their feelings, more years to get married, and only then did they return to this planet. To imply that all of this was some convoluted plan to get humanity's help in a war is nothing but utterly ridiculous.
Detective Fozip sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging as he lowered his guard. All the other officers in the room stared at him, waiting to see how he would proceed. The aggressive interrogator persona seemed to melt away, replaced by something more genuine. "Princess," he said in a friendlier manner, "I just want to understand what happened on this planet. What motivated humanity to save your species? Please assist me. We'll all go away as soon as we understand why humanity was so aggressive in their offer of help. The Federation needs to know if this is going to happen again, if other species are going to start calling on humanity to solve their conflicts. We need to understand the precedent that's been set here." Lixie studied him for a long moment, her anger slowly dissipating like morning mist under sunlight. She could see the genuine confusion in his compound eyes, the real need to understand what had transpired. He wasn't trying to trap her now. He was just a detective, trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into any category the Federation had established. She returned to her couch, settling back into the cushions with a grace that seemed at odds with her recent outburst. The leather creaked softly as she adjusted her position, finding the exact spot where the cushions best supported her spine. She picked up her teacup, noting that the tea had cooled to the perfect temperature, taking another sip before setting it aside on the small table.
"Fine,"
she said, her voice returning to its normal tone.
"I'll tell you the full story, but you need to understand the whole context. It's important. Every piece of this puzzle matters, and if you don't understand our history, you won't understand why humanity acted as they did."
Lixie took a deep breath, adjusted her seating position, and continued.
"My species was discovered by the Federation while we were in what you would consider the medieval age,"
she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller.
"We had castles, knights, primitive agriculture. We thought the stars were the eyes of our ancestors watching over us."
"That's public knowledge, Princess," Detective Fozip interrupted, his antennae moving impatiently. "Every schoolchild in the Federation knows about the Liarian Uplift program." Lixie ignored his observation entirely, continuing as if he hadn't spoken.
"The Crotil were among the first to express interest in trading with us. They arrived in their gleaming ships, descending from the heavens like the gods we'd only imagined in our oldest myths. I still have my great-grandmother's journal from that time. She described the terror and wonder of that first contact, how the priests declared it either the end times or the dawn of a new age."
She stood and moved to a cabinet that had been knocked askew by the search, pulling out a crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. Without asking, she poured herself a glass.
The first successful trade was celebrated across our entire world,
she continued, swirling the liquid in her glass.
We offered what we had in abundance, exotic fruits that grew nowhere else in the known galaxy, seeds from plants that had evolved in our unique biosphere, animals whose genetics fascinated Federation scientists. In return, the Crotil gave us modern farming equipment that could till a field in hours instead of days, and defensive weapons that made our ancient swords look like children's toys.
One of the younger officers, the same species as Fozip but with lighter green skin that suggested youth, shifted nervously. With respect, Your Highness, what's the point of this history lesson? We're investigating recent events, not ancient trade agreements. Lixie turned to him, her violet eyes narrowing slightly.
Just listen, child. You asked for context, and context you shall have.
She returned to her narrative, her voice growing slightly harder.
Everything proceeded beautifully for nearly 3 standard decades. The Crotil became our primary trading partners. They helped us leap forward technologically by centuries in mere years. We went from plowing fields with animals to having automated harvesters. From treating wounds with herbs to having medical scanners that could detect diseases before symptoms appeared.
She paused, taking a sip from her glass. The amber liquid left a faint glow on her lips before she continued.
Then, the Crotil made a discovery that changed everything.
Her voice dropped lower, forcing everyone in the room to lean in slightly.
One of our native plants, we called it silver vine, turned out to have remarkable properties for the Crotil warriors. When they consumed it, their reaction times increased, their strength nearly doubled, and their endurance extended far beyond normal limits. It was, for them, the ultimate performance enhancement drug.
Detective Fozip's antennae perked up with interest, but he said nothing, gesturing for her to continue.
At first, the increased trade seemed like a blessing,
Lixie said, returning to her couch.
The Crotil couldn't get enough silver vine. They paid premium prices, traded advanced technology we wouldn't have accessed for centuries otherwise. My ancestors built entire cities on the wealth that flowed from those trades.
Her expression darkened.
But then, they wanted more than we could produce. Silvervine was a delicate plant. It only grew in certain valleys where the soil composition, altitude, and climate aligned perfectly. We tried to increase production, but pushing the plants too hard killed them. We explained this to the Crotil, showed them the agricultural data, even invited their scientists to study the problem.
She laughed bitterly.
They didn't want to hear it. They accused us of artificially limiting the supply to drive up prices. When we offered them cuttings to try growing on their worlds, they failed. The plant would grow, but without our specific conditions, it produced no active compounds. It was just a pretty vine. That's when they made their proposal,
she continued, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her glass.
They offered us a better planet, one already terraformed with 3 times the landmass, pre-built cities, and advanced infrastructure. All we had to do was leave our homeworld so they could turn the entire planet into a silver vine plantation.
Even Detective Fozip looked shocked at this. His antennae drooped in what might have been sympathy.
We refused, of course,
Lixie said.
This was our home, the world where our species evolved, where every mountain and river had 1,000 years of history and meaning. You don't just abandon your homeworld because someone wants to turn it into a drug farm.
Princess, this is all public record, Detective Fozip interjected, though his tone had lost much of its earlier skepticism. The Silvervine conflict is taught in Federation history classes as a cautionary tale about resource disputes, but I fail to see how this ancient grievance relates to humanity's recent actions. Lixie set down her glass with a sharp click against the table's surface.
This context is crucial if you want to understand why humanity helped us. Without it, their actions seem random, disproportionate. With it,
she let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. Continue, then, Fozip said, settling into a chair across from her, abandoning all pretense of formal interrogation. The other officers had stopped even pretending to search, gathering instead in a loose semicircle to listen.
After we refused their generous offer,
Lixie continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm,
we endured centuries, detective, of Crotil incursions. They would send small groups to raid our Silvervine farms, claiming afterward that these were splinter factions, rogue elements acting without government sanction. The Federation would investigate, issue warnings, impose minor sanctions that the Crotil would pay without blinking.
She stood again, pacing as her anger rebuilt.
Do you know what it's like to watch your farmers murdered in their fields? To see entire harvests stolen in the night? To appeal to the Federation for justice and receive nothing but bureaucratic hand-wringing and hollow promises of investigation?
One of the officers, a reptilian species with scaled skin that shifted from blue to green, spoke up. The Federation has protocols.
The Federation has paperwork,
Lixie snapped.
Mountains of it, enough to build a monument. Each raid was investigated separately. Each time, the Crotil government expressed regret and surprise that such actions had occurred. They'd pay reparations, a pittance compared to what they'd gain from the stolen Silvervine, and promise it wouldn't happen again.
She moved to the window, gazing out at her planet's purple sky.
We adapted, of course. Posted guards, built walls, developed our own defensive capabilities. But we were always playing catch-up, always reacting. The Crotil had centuries of technological advancement on us. Every time we improved our defenses, they found new ways around them. When we finally developed spaceflight capabilities and modern weapons, when we could finally meet them as equals in space, war became inevitable,
she said, turning back to face them.
The Federation tried to mediate. But how do you mediate between a thief and their victim when the thief refuses to acknowledge their crimes? The Crotil maintained their fiction that every raid, every theft, every murdered farmer was the work of criminals they couldn't control.
Detective Fozip's antennae were now perfectly still, focused entirely on her words. And your sister's marriage to the human? How is it related to this conflict? Lixie's expression softened slightly.
My sister met her husband 10 years ago, long before this war reached its crisis point. She saw in humanity something we hadn't found in any other Federation species. A people who understood what it meant to fight for your home, to refuse to be pushed aside by those who thought might made right. But, more importantly,
she said, a slight smile playing at her lips,
she discovered something about humans that would eventually win us this war.
What did she discover? Fozip asked, leaning forward with obvious interest.
She discovered that humans have a very particular relationship with food,
Lixie said. The officers exchanged confused glances. What did human cooking preferences have to do with interstellar war?
One day, my sister was preparing a traditional Liarian meal for Henry using our native spices and herbs. She included dried and ground silvervine leaves. For us, it's just a mild flavoring agent, like what humans call pepper or paprika. Henry went absolutely wild for it, said it was the best barbecue seasoning he'd ever tasted. Started putting it on everything. Steaks, ribs, even vegetables.
Detective Fozip's compound eyes widened as the implications began to dawn on him.
Word spread among the human expatriate community on our planet,
Lixie continued, clearly enjoying the growing horror on the detective's face.
Soon, every human who tried Silvervine seasoning wanted more. They started sharing it with friends and family back on Earth. Within 2 years, humanity had developed what could only be described as an obsession with what they called Liarian purple spice.
She paused for effect, watching as understanding rippled through the room like a wave.
My father was still alive then, still king. He saw an opportunity, a way to end this war. He made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't understand humans.
She returned to her couch, settling in for the revelation.
He sold every single Silvervine farm to human buyers. Not leased, not partnered, sold outright. Humans now owned the land where Silvervine grew. They believed the Crotil wouldn't dare to attack the farms now. The deeds were filed with both Liarian and Earth property registries recognized by interstellar law.
Detective Fozip had gone very still, his green skin paling to an almost white shade. The other officers had frozen in place, as if sudden movement might make the situation worse.
The Crotil didn't care about the new ownership,
Lixie said quietly.
They planned their biggest raid yet. A massive offensive to seize our entire Silvervine production capacity while our military was engaged on the frontier. 300 Crotil ships descended like they always had.
She leaned forward, her violet eyes gleaming.
They killed 63 humans. Farmers who had been tending their legally purchased property, growing their barbecue seasoning in peace. The Crotil raiders even sent messages back to their command, boasting about how they'd finally secured permanent control over the Silvervine supply.
The room was so quiet that Lixie could hear the heartbeats.
Humanity's response was? You already know that,
she said softly.
They treated it as an act of war against Earth itself. 63 dead humans, killed while farming their legally owned land? The Crotil had no idea what they'd unleashed. The human fleet arrived within 18 hours,
she continued.
Not a peacekeeping force, not negotiators. Their full, rapid response fleet. They didn't issue warnings, they didn't negotiate. They simply announced that any Crotil military vessel in the system had 10 minutes to surrender or be destroyed.
One of the younger officers made a small sound of distress.
The Crotil, in their arrogance, refused.
Lixie shook her head.
1/3 of the Crotil military was eliminated in less than 20 standard hours,
she said, her voice returning to normal volume.
Humanity was very careful. They targeted only military assets, but they were thorough. Every ship that had transported raiders, every base that had supplied them, every command center that had coordinated them, all gone.
Detective Fozip finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. They did all this over seasoning.
They did this over property rights and murder,
Lixie corrected.
63 humans were killed on their own land they'd purchased fairly. The fact that they were growing what they considered the galaxy's best barbecue seasoning just made them take it personally.
She stood, smoothing her dress.
So you see, Detective, we didn't hire humanity. We didn't need to. We simply aligned our interests with theirs in a completely legal manner. The Crotil started a war with humanity all by themselves when they murdered human farmers. That humanity's response happened to save our species from 20 years of grinding defeat. Well, that's just fortunate timing.
The detective stood, his legs seeming unsteady. The other officers began backing toward the door, their search completely forgotten. They looked like people who had just realized they were standing in a room with a predator. Not Lixie herself, but the specter of human intervention that her story had conjured. "We'll need to speak with your sister and her husband," Fozip managed, his professional training reasserting itself despite his obvious shock.
"They're on Earth now,"
Lixie said smoothly.
"and Earth doesn't recognize Federation authority for interrogation of their citizens on their soil."
The detective's antennae drooped in defeat. He knew as well as she did that Earth would never allow Federation investigators to interrogate one of their own about military actions taken in defense of human citizens. It would be seen as an admission of wrongdoing, and humanity had been very clear that they'd done nothing wrong. "I see," Fozip said, gathering his datapads with shaking hands. "I believe we have sufficient information for our report. The Federation Council will need to review these circumstances." The other officers were already filing out, eager to be away from this room where they'd learned just how easily a war could start over something as simple as seasoning. They moved quickly, but carefully, as if sudden movements might somehow invoke human attention. Detective Fozip paused at the door, turning back to look at Lixie. "Your Highness, you realize what you've done, what precedent this sets." Lixie met his gaze steadily.
"We survived, Detective. After centuries of being preyed upon, dismissed, and ignored by the Federation's bureaucracy, we found a way to survive. If that troubles you, perhaps you should ask yourself why the Federation failed to protect us in the first place."
He had no answer to that. With a final nod, he left, the door sliding shut behind him. Lixie stood perfectly still for 30 seconds after the door closed, counting her breaths. Then she pulled out her datapad. The screen filled with multiple camera feeds showing the Federation investigators making their way through the palace corridors, past the ancient tapestries and modern security checkpoints, their pace just short of a run. She tracked them through the grand entrance, and only when she saw their vessel clear the planet's atmosphere, when the tracking system confirmed they'd engaged their jump drive and left the system entirely, did she allow herself to relax. Her fingers moved to a different app, initiating a quantum-encrypted communication channel with Earth. The connection took longer than usual. Earth's communication systems were notoriously paranoid about security. But eventually the screen shimmered and resolved into the image of her sister. Crown Princess Vexa looked radiant, her silver hair pinned up in an elaborate style that was distinctly human in origin, decorated with small purple flowers that Lixie recognized as earth violets. She was sitting in what appeared to be a garden, with green plants that seemed almost obscenely lush compared to their homeworld's more subdued purple vegetation. Beside her, Henry lounged in a chair.
"Lixie!"
Vexa exclaimed, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure.
"How did it go? We've been worried sick."
Lixie collapsed onto her couch with a dramatic sigh that would have been undignified if anyone else had been watching.
"For a moment there, I thought our entire species would be held accountable."
Henry laughed, a deep, rich sound that filled the connection. Even through the quantum distortion, his amusement was infectious. "You thought you'd be arrested before convincing them we went to war over barbecue sauce?"
"This isn't funny, Henry,"
Lixie said, but she was fighting back a smile.
"If they'd found any evidence of formal arrangement between our government and Earth, the Federation would have seized our assets, arrested the royal family, possibly even imposed military oversight of our planet."
"But they didn't find anything," Henry said, leaning into frame, his expression growing more serious. "Because there wasn't anything to find. Every transaction was legitimate, private commerce. Every deed was filed properly. The Crotil attacked human citizens on human property. Everything that followed was simply consequence. Lixie pretended to glare at him, but her relief was too great to maintain the facade.
You would have saved me, though, wouldn't you? If they'd tracked me to some Federation prison station?
Henry was about to deny it. She could see the dismissal forming on his lips, but Vexa interrupted.
Please, I saw the Earth news feeds, dear. The moment word got out about the investigation, there were already human veteran groups organizing humanitarian observation missions to ensure the fair treatment of our people.
She smiled at her husband.
3 different barbecue associations started fundraising campaigns to, and I quote, protect the source of purple gold from Federation interference.
Purple gold? Lixie asked, raising an eyebrow. That's what they're calling Silvervine seasoning now, Henry explained, looking slightly embarrassed. It's become quite the phenomenon. There are entire social media communities dedicated to finding the perfect purple gold blend, cooking competitions, even some restaurants that specialize in it.
The price has tripled in the last month,
Vexa added. There was a moment of comfortable silence, the kind that exists between family members who have weathered a crisis together. Lixie studied her sister's face, noting the small changes, a lightness around her eyes, a relaxation in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. Earth was good for her.
We bought a farm?
Vexa said suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to her.
Here on Earth, I mean, in a place called Montana. Henry says the climate might work for some of our native food plants.
Lixie's diplomatic mind immediately began calculating implications.
That's significant. Liarian-owned property on Earth itself. I paid for it,
Vexa said with a touch of pride.
My own funds, from my portion of the royal treasury. It's officially registered as belonging to a Liarian citizen.
After the call ended, Lixie sat in her chambers, now restored to order by the palace staff who had swooped in the moment the investigators left. She pulled up the news feeds on her datapad, scanning through dozens of stories about the Silvervine incident, as historians were already calling it. Some Federation species were calling for sanctions against humanity for their disproportionate response. Others were quietly reviewing their own relationships with humans, making sure they hadn't inadvertently given offense. The Crotil were notably silent, their government having issued only a brief statement about regrettable losses due to the unauthorized actions of criminal elements. But what caught Lixie's attention were the human news feeds. Story after story about the 63 farmers who had died. Their names, their faces, their families. Humans had a tradition, she learned, of remembering their dead individually, not just as statistics. Each farmer was being mourned not as a casualty of war, but as a person who had died doing what they loved, working the land, growing something special. Lixie found herself smiling despite the sadness of the story. Humans were perhaps the strangest species in the galaxy, capable of devastating violence in defense of their own, yet also capable of finding humor even in tragedy. They would go to war over seasoning, yet welcome former enemies as friends if given proper reason. Lixie closed the newsfeed, a wry smile touching her lips. The galaxy saw a disproportionate military response. She saw perfect, poetic justice. For centuries, her people had played by the Federation's rules and lost. They won only when they learned to play by humanity's. Let the other species study fleet formations and weapon yields. The Liarians had learned the more vital lesson. The most dangerous force in the universe wasn't a warship, but a principle. And for humanity, few principles were more sacred than protecting their own, especially when they were just trying to enjoy a good meal.